So here we go. I'm Nora Roughen-Schmidt, Executive Director for the Viroqua Chamber Main Street, and I'm here with my co-host Luke Zahm, and this is 54665. Today we're going to be chatting with Darrin Wasniewski, Downtown Development Program Manager at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, about strategic doing for nonprofits. Welcome, Darrin.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Darrin.
Hey,
Thanks for being here. So this is the first episode that we've done for 54665 that is nonprofit related. We've been talking a lot about small business. Can you tell me what strategic doing is? What does that mean?
strategic doing is a process for planning. It was developed by a gentleman by the name of Ed Morrison, who's currently with Purdue's Agile Strategy Labs. And it was born out of his experience in 20 years consulting in economic and community development. And it's just a way of putting the planning process into more action-oriented than taking months and months and months to plan and then launch into action. I had talked in a previous episode about my business planning on Post-it notes, which is done in a lean startup approach, a canvas model approach to business planning. And this is truly a lean startup for strategic planning. You look at an idea that you have, you try to work through what's the what we call the big easy, what's the easiest to implement, which have the highest visibility in what it goes out there, and get moving in that direction. Once you launch it, you're going to learn something about it. So come back together in a specified period of time, usually 30 days, talk about what you learned, then based on that knowledge, where are you going? So iterative in its approach. The tech field is using this. Agile strategy is a big buzzword right now. Lean startup, it's all of that stuff.
So, Luke and I are no stranger to nonprofits and challenges, as he is the president of my board of directors. As we're planning, and our nonprofit is constantly planning and reevaluating and trying to make sure that we're connecting as a board so that we're serving the community in the most positive way, how does strategic doing help the annual process or a 5-year planning process for a nonprofit?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is to go all the way back to the core of what's happening and just what a nonprofit is, as well as what a community is, and what nature is. There's a way of thinking about it, and it's called a complex adaptive system. So if you think about a system out there, let's use your car, for instance, that if your fuel pump goes out in your car, you buy a new fuel pump, you put it in its place. It's a sum of its parts. It's not a complex adaptive system. If it were, you could take a brake master cylinder, put it where the fuel pump went, and it would still work fine, but that's not going to happen. Nature is not like that. Your forests aren't like that. Your wetland preserves, the way animals interact, they're all complex adaptive system, and we translate that into our communities. So, in our districts, we have businesses that fill our buildings, and if one of those goes out, you don't necessarily have to put it back in with that specific business. You can put it with something else and it'll adapt and it'll keep things going. And so the strategic doing process really capitalizes on that. The challenge with complex adaptive systems is they can't operate without rules because otherwise they'd be chaos. And so just having a simple set of rules that are out there. So for instance, if you can visualize a flock of birds flying, they seem to fly in the same direction. If there's movement, they all go in the same direction. There's no wires that attach them together that are tethered together. There's no pre-planning meeting going out and say, here's where we're going to go. We're going to turn left here. They use the complex adaptive system process. And so their simple rules are we head in this direction. We avoid predators. We avoid anything that might hurt us. And so they're always taking cues from the bird next to them, and that's how they move without any direction or intercommunication. And so when we work with our nonprofits, that's a freeing way to realize that, we can do this. We don't have to have the answer. Everybody wants the solution. And quite honestly, the solution may not be out there. You just have to be able to work at it. So we have a hypothesis, and you start working towards it. and then, you do some work, an action plan that gets you closer to it, then take some time back and say, based on that, we've now learned this. Is this still the direction we need to go? And if not, where do we have to change? And if it is, then keep going in that direction till you get this done. So the strategic doing process really does provide you those 10 simple rules that help guide this process, and gets everybody involved. It makes everybody an owner. What I love is in the process, it's often talked about that everybody around the table has an asset that they bring. And most people, unfortunately, just love to come into these things to pontificate. And let me tell you what you should do. And here is, if you're going to be at the table, you bring something to the table, and you need to put it out there in order for the good of the community. And it really gets that ownership and trust built among people.
You're talking a little bit. We do something. It's a rolling plan on a page, right? It's a 3-year document that's always rolling,
right?
And I think for us as an organization in the Viroqua Chamber Main Street, we like to look at that. And every year when we pull all the board members back and do our February retreat, we're allowed at that point to really examine and re-examine the goals and the mission of the organization for that year. We put up, some things that we know are relatively fixed on the whiteboards. We know that we are a promotional organization for our member businesses. We know that we like to endeavor in regional marketing. But then, we're always reevaluating, how do we get there? And developing goals and strategies that will carry us over, hopefully within a 3-year timeline. The beauty of that process is it pushes us every year to look at that and redetermine, our adaptive strategy, so to speak.
Right.
Is a 5 5 years was what you had mentioned earlier. Is the timeline, do you think that's fixed? Is it important to look that far into the future? Or do you think that it's relatively arbitrary?
In my opinion, I think it's relatively arbitrary. That, especially we say in today's world, but I can only imagine that, if you look through technological advancements through the 1900s, it was pretty constant, and things were shaken up all the time. And so, it makes you just wonder, how much do we truly know what this is going to look like in 5 years? And so, through the strategic doing process, you come into contact with other methods of thinking. And I just finished a book called The One Thing. And, the basis of that is just having set priorities. And it does look at that. It says, okay, let's look at what's our someday goal. Where would we want to be? Okay, and then what is something we need to do within 5 years to help us reach that someday goal? Then back it up. What's something we need to do in a year to help us reach that 5-year goal, to reach that someday goal? And I think that, if we can just keep going on that one, and I think the biggest point is, don't be prepared to die on the hill for that 5-year goal, because you might realize it needs to change. Mm-hmm. And so just be adaptive enough to say, you know what, here's where we thought we wanted to go. And as we're getting into it, that isn't where we need to go. And therefore, let's look at something else. What's another opportunity for us? We're not going to try to fit everything into this. And I think that comes down, in the business planning approach, as I saw it, used to do some business coaching. And in the traditional approach, you'd have so much time invested in that very large document that, people would say, I'm going to make this work no matter what. The market is telling you something completely different, but you are going to make your idea work just because you have a lot invested in it. Rather than, the lean startup approach is, here's where I think I want to go. Let's start working towards it and get feedback from the market and make adjustments accordingly.
Sure. How many nonprofits in your experience actually have a defined someday goal? Because I've worked with a number of nonprofits, and hearing you say that, I'm reflecting, I'm not exactly sure I've ever worked with one that has a someday goal.
I think they're very few, unfortunately, and they don't realize the ramifications of it. That, maybe when they first started, they did, and that was, many years ago, and now they've moved on and they haven't revisited it, and they think, oh, it's just, mumbo jumbo, vision and mission and all that other stuff. But really that translates down into getting people to buy into where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
That you really can't get people to come along if they don't know where you're going. It's not like, hey, come here and we'll just figure this thing out as we go along. It's no, here's where we want to be. Do you want to invest in us? Do you want to help us see this thing through? And that's the way to get people, committed to where you're going. And so it's really important. As I found, as I work with the organizations around here, unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often. And that's sort of my own personal mission is to get folks to do that, to really make this part of the process, and then even bring it out on a month-to-month basis. I think, board members get disengaged because board meeting tends to be report out. And who wants to sit there for an hour and a half, 2 hours and listen to report outs? I think it's important to have a clear understanding of where you're going, but half the time should be set up to looking at something strategically. The 4 roles of nonprofit boards are strategic thinking, fiduciary responsibility, resource development, and leadership development. And they should really spend some time at each board meeting looking at one of those 4 points and where they're going.
That's great. Nora, I'm gonna pick on you here for a second.
Oh, good.
Yeah, no. Someday goals. I think that this is kind of a new thing, and wow, talk about blowing the lid off on a podcast for me. Thanks a lot. That's great. You have no idea how much I'm gonna end up dumping this on the chamber board or the Main Street board here. But I guess, how does that grab you as an executive director? Someone who works within the framework of a lot of the doings and thinkings of the strategic doing model that we try and implement. How does that make you feel? Is that something that gives you like shape and direction and meaning? Or are they kind of targets that you're just, throwing darts at to try and knock down?
Thanks for this one.
Yeah, this is good. This is why people tune in.
This is why people tune in. Because I have worked with Darrin so closely for so many years, I have always had strategic doing things in mind, but I do have some goals based on how we're doing in terms of visibility, how we're doing financially, how we're doing in terms of other growth for the Viroqua Chamber Main Street. So I think, not to unveil anything here, but I would really like to see the Viroqua Chamber Main Street, because of some pretty major successes over the last 4 years, talk about building ownership and real investment in community by actually owning a building. So
Sure.
That's something that is, a few years down the way. And there have been some things that we're doing to actively work toward that. Mm-hmm. Bigger, better fundraising, more accessibility, more partners and members, more regional activity. So I think we're on that path.
And I would say that you're doing a fantastic job, just being able to put that out there. I think that your vision and oftentimes your doing in the context of this conversation has really facilitated and opened up a lot of possibility for the organization. One of the things I want to jump into, though, and kind of pick Darrin's brain on this now, because I'm suddenly seeing my role as moderator in this conversation, financial success, specifically for nonprofits. Obviously, they have to be relatively successful in order to do that. But how much do you let the financial success guide the strategic doing?
That's a tough one. I think there's an interdependence between the two elements. And going back to, okay, if you're bootstrapping it as a nonprofit and you don't have a lot of finances, it's never good to sit back and say, well, we can't do this and we can't do that. Start talking about what you can do. Mm-hmm. That whole scalable model. What can we do with $100, at least to show impact? Because we can't really get anybody excited about our cause unless we're showing we're doing something. And so I think that that same notion applies to those who have enjoyed a little bit of financial success, that they have a little bit more cash that they can work with. And so looking at that as a resource, what can be done that you can move into, make something happen. What are those goals? But I often cringe when communities or organizations, they talk about oh, I can't do this because we don't have that much money. Strategic doing is very much about utilizing the assets that you do have, not the ones that you don't. And one of the best analogies I've heard at a colleague from Indiana say it. She said, strategic doing or strategic planning is like getting a recipe. You have a dinner party on Saturday, you pick out a recipe, you look at the recipe card, and you look in your cupboards in your refrigerator, and like, I've got this, I need to go to the market and get this stuff. That's all well and good if you have the means to go buy those things. As my wife would say, every time we have people over, she cringes because it's a $500 grocery bill because I'm finding some unique spice that's, or a new piece of equipment that needs to be purchased. But if you have the means, great. If not, then that recipe is not going to work out so well. Strategic doing is it being a Tuesday night and you need to make dinner and you've had a long day at work and you open up the refrigerator and like, here's what we have to work with. I'm making dinner out of this. I'm not going anywhere and I have to have something that's edible. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do to make it work? And so that is truly utilizing the assets that exist, in the refrigerator or, for the nonprofits within the board, within the network, because the power of the work is a broader network. And we're realizing that more and more in the United States, that things aren't getting done because somebody at the top wills it. That isn't the way things work anymore. That was great after World War II and people were accustomed to that. But now you're looking at, look at the network that Apple has built that goes into building an iPhone and that's out there. Or movie studios, movie studios used to have this vertical supply chain from the top to the bottom and they controlled everything. Now it's all subcontractors that do all that. And the networks are just huge. And that's the power of making everything happen.
We've talked about this a little bit, but what makes an effective nonprofit board? I'm in a situation with my board of directors. We have a very functional dynamic. We are doing our best to solve problems and at the same point do the reporting that's necessary so that everybody feels up to speed on things that are occurring and also feels invested in the organization. What makes for an effective board, and how do you create that dynamic if you don't have it already?
Yeah, I think we just recently in Wisconsin had Mark Smiley from Solid Ground Consulting do 2 years worth of board development trainings around here. And he just speaks so much truth into this very topic. It starts with the culture of the organization. What is the board? What culture does the board have? Why would somebody want to join the board? Why would somebody leave another board to join your board? And what are you doing to foster that? And then the culture just really dictates actions. I often see accountability as one of those things, that people join an organization because they want to make a difference. And so when you have somebody on the board and they make a commitment to get something done, if you don't have a culture of accountability, then, the time frame comes and, hey, did you do this? Life got in the way. I'm sorry, I couldn't make that happen. And then, okay, well, just try it again. Well, years go past and nothing ever happens. Well, therefore, everybody else takes that culture on that, we don't need to do anything. Therefore, you become ineffective and it's tough to get people to buy in. If you have a culture of accountability, and it's not like you're going to browbeat somebody or shame them into there, but, hey, I didn't get this done. You take them aside. Hey, I understand, life gets in the way. Could you get it? This is really important for the next phase. Could you get this done within 2 weeks? It's a totally different conversation that we're not letting you off the hook. Mm-hmm. We understand something got in the way, but you committed to this. Can you get this done? And so I think that, that accountability is a big way. One of the tools that Mark Smiley talks about is a board member personal action plan, that you go through an exercise with the board of all the different elements that makes that organization run, from fundraising to leadership development to strategic planning, and you list them all out just on a flip chart. And every board member on a 3x5 card writes down 3 things that they commit to do in that next year, and then it's all passed on to another board member. It can't ever be staff, because there's always that staff, it has to be peer-to-peer relationship, that, if staff gets after somebody, it's nagging, but if another board member gets in, we're all in this together, how do we make this happen? And then before the end of that day, before the end of that meeting, the person reads off one of those things they've committed to. and now it's out there publicly. There's you want accountability, announce something publicly that you're going to do it, and
Right.
that'll get you accountability. And so that's a great way, in building culture. But I think our organizations don't take enough time to understand the culture and to build towards the culture that they want, because that is the framework of everything. I'd invite people to go over to Places blog on WEDC's website, because I just did a whole blog post series about building board culture and planning. And so I get into a lot more detail on the importance of that.
Awesome. And then my final question was just about other resources for strategic doing. I know you've mentioned a couple of different books. What are some of the best resources? So if people are listening and they're really interested in diving into this just a little bit further, where should they go?
Yeah, there's strategicdoing.net, which is the website. I have to admit, as far as what's out there publicly, I'm not sure, because I've been trained into it. I have back end on the website, and I never really go to the public one. So,
Sure.
But I do know from others, there's lots of articles on what to do. I do encourage you, if this is a process that you want to pursue, bring in a third-party facilitator. It's really tough to do. Any facilitation should not be done from within the organization, because everybody needs to be a participant, and the facilitator cannot or should not be that participant. But you can reach me through WEDC, and we have worked with a variety of groups, from local nonprofits to countywide organizations to regional planning, economic development organizations, on utilizing this process. The other one I mentioned, I'm just really happy about a book I just finished. It's by Gary Keller, and it's The One Thing. And it really helped me change my thinking about planning. And it comes down to setting priorities, and their big thing is time blocking, removing distractions. And we had talked earlier as we came in about, hey, mornings are a productive time. Well, what are you doing to make sure that's your creative time? Because if you fill that with administrative time, then your creativity is lost in the afternoon, possibly, and you're not being as productive as you possibly be. So that was a true game changer for me in reading that book.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Darrin, thanks so much for coming in. We really appreciate your insight and your ability to share it with all of us. You've been listening to the 54665. Tune in next week.